Thank you for having me, inviting me to come speak. Russ has filled me in about what he's been teaching you about the independent media, and I'm here to fill you in on the things that have happened in the last 20 years that are more kind of insider kinds of information, and are not necessarily well known outside of the independent media sector, which is basically how it's changed from in the last 16 years, especially since Trump was elected, but even before that. Um, Now, I know that Raza has spoken to you about what the difference is between independent media and corporate media. And I'm kind of here to fill in the nuances, to kind of add nuance to that story, and also talk about, basically what's essentially become the political economy of the media and where independent media fits in or doesn't fit in or has similar struggles as corporate media right now. So let me just start by saying that I've been involved in all sectors of the media, from community and ethnic media to alternative media to public media to some, I wouldn't call C-SPAN necessarily corporate media, but it's fairly mainstream in a lot of ways. And now I'm very much involved in the trend since the economy collapsed in 2008, and hundreds of journalists lost their jobs at news organizations around the country, many of whom have formed their own nonprofit journalism websites. And over the last nearly 20 years now, let's see, so 2008, actually more than 20 years at this point. Am I right? No, I'm getting my math wrong. 2008 is when the economy collapsed. So so 14 years later. What was taken for granted at one time of the role of the independent media has really changed because of technology, because of the economy, and also especially because of the rise of a very healthy right-wing media infrastructure. And so at one time in its heyday, independent media such as The Nation and Mother Jones and the environmental magazines and the women's magazines and the policy magazines like American Prospect, et cetera. I don't know how many of those publications you're familiar with, but their primary reason for existence was basically to publish stories that weren't being told by corporate media. These were stories that countered the establishment narrative, challenged authority, the official authorities on stories. And the basic premise was that if they could get out the truth, so to speak, or what was really going on in our country, that would be enough to turn people's thinking around. And during the 60s and 70s, when these publications began to proliferate, that was true. And in fact, I got awoken through the local Bay Area alternative newspaper in San Francisco called the Bay Guardian. I picked up that newspaper one day, and all these reporters that were formerly New York Times reporters and former reporters of AP and et cetera, who had actually seen what was going on in Vietnam and were trying to push those stories out, weren't getting published. And so I began to read stories like that in alternative weeklies, and that was my introduction to what would then might be called the independent media. It was alternative media. So from between the 60s and the 80s, there was a proliferation of these alternative independent publications, mostly not radio or TV so much then. And that was the beginning of, I think, my generation, the boomer generation's disillusionment with what our government was telling us at that time. Now, since then, the independent media has grown and branched into many different sectors. Not all of them are political or policy oriented. There are a lot of lifestyle magazines and periodicals. There are basically lifestyle, really. And some spiritual magazines and things like that break away from the dominant narratives in their counterparts in mainstream media. Today, the independent media has moved in a different direction now because it really has been struggling to survive financially. I was a founding member of the Media Consortium, which I understand you have heard about. Or, Raza, have you talked about the Media Consortium?
Yes, very briefly, but you please do explain more.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. The Media Consortium was formed in the early 2000s by primarily actually a group of activists who are media activists. And the founder was very aware that one of the biggest problems with progressive publications was that they were so focused on their ideological content and that they did not understand the business of publishing. And it was because of that these magazines were not thriving very well. So the Media Consortium was essentially the progressive counterpart to what's called the Magazine Publishers of America, which is essentially the publishing association for most mainstream magazines. And, and ASNE, the American Society of Newspaper Editors, was also the newspaper side of that. So the objective of Media Consortium was to help these publications understand business, because so many progressives were allergic to the very idea of business. And so the IPA, the Independent Press Association, I'm sorry, I'm jumping all over the place. The Media Consortium is actually a second generation of an organization that I belonged to in the early 2000s called the Independent Press Association. And they were the ones that recognized the lack of business savvy that was at the heart of these failing publications. And, business savvy has to do with with distribution and reaching out to a wider audience than the converted audiences of those publications. So the IPA was on the cutting edge of this, and it was funded by actually some of the biggest foundations in the country at that time. And we got money to develop loan programs for the magazines and the revolving loan funds where the magazines could take out loans to help sustain whatever business, whether it was through distribution necessities or publishing necessities, being able to hire staff, et cetera, and actually offer decent salaries. Now, the IPA went very strong, and then it collapsed in 2006, basically because of internal problems. It went bankrupt, and a lot of the cutting edge ideas almost died. And then the Media Consortium was formed basically out of the publications that were members of the Media Consortium. And it was formed right after 2006 when the IPA went down. And unfortunately, the Media Consortium also didn't last very long because it was never able to organize, it's like herding cats, trying to organize these publications and trying to deal with their sustainability on the business side. Was a focus of these publications, to the exclusion of dealing with some real issues about what audiences they were trying to cultivate in order to reach out to a wider audience. And so even though ideologically these publications supported equity and diversity and supported the ideas of hiring more people of color and having content produced by more people of color, they just consistently argue that they didn't have the bandwidth or the time to deal with what they've considered an ancillary problem compared to their daily issues of sustainability, basic sustainability. So, but it did produce a very interesting consortium of people working in the independent media sector who did come together and formed an unusual cohort. It was a very, very lively cohort of people. It was a very lively network to be a part of. And to know that, to understand what the environment was in trying to push out different narratives on news. Now, so since the Media Consortium went down, I forget when, I think around 2012 or 13, somewhere around there. And I was on the executive committee of Media Consortium and, pretty much saw a lot of things going on from the inside. So now you have the Independent Press, the INN, the Institute for Nonprofit News, which has become the association for independent news, which has been now redefined to include the myriad number, I mean, dozens and dozens of nonprofit news sites that arose out of the 2008, disaster that downsized so many news organizations. And I think the INN, the Institute for Nonprofit News, now has maybe a couple of hundred members. And they are really dealing with some solid business sustainability issues. And because many people came from commercial media and had that experience, they're able to kind of translate that stuff better than the Independent Press Association was able to, or the Media Consortium. Now, the downside of that is that because so many of the starters of these sites, founders of these sites, came right from mainstream media. So there was a long learning curve. And first of all, them admitting that the organizations that used to pay them very hefty salaries were actually not producing good news, and that it was not a good thing. So, and with the increasing toxic and political environment in our country, that's become much more evident to these editors and reporters. And so they're now slowly, and especially after George Floyd, they're now slowly dealing with these kinds of issues. But it's, there are still struggles with what supposedly objectivity means. There are still struggles with equating diversity in the newsroom and equity issues with woke politics. There's fears of that. There's real hesitation around cancel culture that gets in the way of people really wanting to make some drastic changes within their newsrooms. And what's also interesting that's happening is that generationally, young journalists, the journalists of color that have managed to get into these newsrooms are actually revolting. The Washington Post has had an uprising. There's been some, discord at the New York Times. And the smaller independent media are struggling with the same issues. So, you combine that with the fact that you now have a right-wing media infrastructure that is in many ways far more sophisticated than the mainstream corporate structure, because they are dealing with propaganda. They are dealing with deliberate disinformation. And many experts, pundits and experts are talking about how they actually are they're using Mein Kampf, the book of the Nazis, as their playbook. And in fact, President Orban of Hungary is considered a real hero among right-wing media people. So now people who are working in the independent media and still in corporate media and in nonprofit media are still having, progressive media totally understands this, but the other sectors don't quite want to admit this. And it means that they're still behind the ball in really looking at what their narratives are and what they consider, quote, objective journalism. And really, the challenges to their fundamental understandings about what journalism is supposed to be all about. And we're in the middle of that struggle right now. And it's taken our country to get to the political extremes that it's reached right now in order for mainstream folks, both audience and publications and reporters and journalists, to really understand that what this threat is to our democracy and what the role of the media should be. I'll stop right here before I go on. Are there any questions about what I'm saying so far?
Are there any questions or anything specifically you wish to intervene at this point, or Linda? Yeah, so Linda, I think, no, please go on. And I would say just talk a little more about INN, just a bit more on the kind of things they do in terms of sustainability of these independent outlets, nonprofit newsrooms.
Yeah, well, there are several different tracks on that. One is when certainly after George Floyd, people are much more open now to including funders to developing programs to help these organizations diversify more. People are standing up, particularly people of color in those editorial and newsrooms are standing up and raising the questions about objectivity and raising the questions about challenge, not always relying on official sources and not always relying on the dominant culture for stories and for voices. And so where race and racial equity is concerned, members of the Media Consortium are becoming much more awake to that, though not in a lot of places. I mean, a lot of these nonprofit news publications exist in cities and towns that are primarily white, and they don't see the kinds of conflicts that are normally seen in larger urban areas or in places where there are more people of color. So it's a little harder grasp for those organizations. I mean, they understand what the issues are intellectually, but they also think they don't really apply to them necessarily. Mm-hmm. So right now, the focus is on, right now, INN's focus is on helping to build sustainability. It's helping to get them organized around raising more money, becoming more savvy about business stuff, all the things that Media Consortium and the Independent Press Association tried to do. And the INN started out being a primarily mainstream membership, mainstream fallouts, dropouts. And but since the Media Consortium went down, there have been several, I don't know how many members of the Media Consortium are now a part of INN. But there are somewhat, I wouldn't say super stringent requirements to join, but the main thing is that these organizations cannot be partisan driven and be funded by partisan organizations. So in terms of things that are going on now, I think that they're just, they're taking their cues from people like me, who has been very involved around equity issues for the last, 25 years or more, and from other people. And in terms of trying to figure out how to get some critical mass around those issues. Mainstream media, it's kind of, hit and miss. And for the independent progressive publications that are not, because they're too partisan or too ideologically driven, that are not members of INN, their issues again are basically basic sustainability, and where that fits in, where they integrate equity issues I think it remains a question. Really, it's kind of a question mark. It's not well organized right now. And the main principle that I've been working on is getting the journalists and editors to understand that this is not simply about, affirmative action. It's not simply a business solution. That, or rather, it's not simply a matter of recruitment or even incentives for retainment. So it's not about professional development, and it's not about professional recruitment. What this is an organizing problem, and that they need to understand that they need to that there's a real compelling issue around diversifying the media, that racism is built into our system all the way around. They need to understand the structural problems, structural racism, institutional racism, and that the solutions really involve some aspect of social solutions, not just business solutions, and not just professional development solutions. And so I think that the younger generation of journalists of color who are coming in understand that. They're also bringing in the anger and the zeal of young protesters, young dissidents. And so then we're having an increasing problem around cancel culture, that the older progressive, people like me who used to be activists before we became journalists are wrestling with, how we used to be back when we were their age. Now we're actually, the chickens are coming home and we're dealing with this problem with the younger activists. So I don't know if that answers your question, Raza.
Yes, thank you. And, I was intrigued by the fact that you at the start mentioned about independent versus mainstream corporate media. So we have been talking about that in terms of ownership largely, but maybe if you can elaborate on some kind of a definition. I know it's difficult, but because there are too many definitions. But how would we define independent media?
Well, Jeff defines independent media according to how the Izzy's, what the Izzy definition is, right? That it's that a news organization has only X number of well, actually, Raza, you can explain it better than I. What is the definition of independent media for the Izzy's again?
Oh, so it is basically not, that it is not owned by large corporate organizations. So it's a non-corporate media. Could be
right.
community, could be non-profit.
But is there a budget? Is there a budget ceiling?
Well, I mean, yeah, informally, but no, not formally defined.
And I know that they can't own more than one or two other entities, something like that.
Yes.
Okay.
One, not more than two other subsidiaries,
Yeah. I tell you, this is where the right-wing muddying of things is really showing up, because they consider themselves independent media.
Yeah.
So, the definition of independent media is getting increasingly fuzzy. But what used to be independent media was precisely news organizations made up of they're journalistically based, although they didn't used to be that way. I mean, in the 60s and early 70s, they were very ideologically based. And then they realized that they couldn't get out their message if they weren't didn't practice more journalistic principles and values. So independent media, to me, and I think for a lot of progressives, is, pursuit of the truth that challenges the dominant narratives, and challenges, literally speaks truth to power. And I mean, that definition still holds, I think, for people who are serious journalists.
Yes,
and that definition holds for mainstream. That definition holds for mainstream reporters who are investigative reporters, especially. So.
Right. Thank you, Linda. Okay, please continue if you want to. You wanted to finish your earlier comments.
Yeah, I just want to get into more about misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda, and media literacy. It used to be that people could read their newspapers and pretty much depend on fairly accurate reporting, from the sources that they turn to. And nowadays, a lot of people who don't read a lot of, who basically rely on maybe like used to rely on their daily newspaper and maybe one or two or three other sources of news, feel like they no longer can depend on any source. And they feel like they're conflicting narratives, conflicting stories, and they don't know who to believe. And my own husband, who's very well read, very intelligent, complains about that all the time. And he's a pretty wide reader. And I think that it's important that the journalists coming into this business really understand how their audiences, what their audiences' literacy needs are, media news literacy needs are when they're reporting. And it's no longer just a matter of reporting the facts. It's really providing a context for those facts and answering questions and challenging sources in a way that your audiences aren't going to be able to do, in order for them to figure out what's going on and in order for them to trust your reporting. You have to be able to ask the kinds of questions that your readership and your listenership are going to come up with. And you also have to challenge whatever their assumptions and their biases are through your reporting. So it also means that you should be on top of a wide variety of news sources, including watching what right-wing rhetoric is. What are they saying on their news programs, and what is, people throw their hands up and they just, liberals tend to just throw their hands up and just say, I don't understand this. How could this be? The truth is so obvious. Well, the truth is being manipulated. And we as journalists, it's our responsibility to counter that manipulation through very in-depth, wide breadth reporting. and really knowing how to vet our sources. And through your reporting, your readers and your listeners are able to learn how to vet sources based on how your stories are produced. But there's nothing I can think of that's really more urgent right now than journalists really organizing themselves against the status quo of corporate media, and even the status quo in progressive media. I mean, there are ideological issues in progressive media that need to be dealt with as well. So, am I getting across my message here?
Yes, I think so. How about you guys? You okay? Yes. There are many nods.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, you can't see them all because of our camera positioning.
Yeah.
But I can.
Okay. And let's see what
Yeah,
we're talking about.
Yeah, you were talking about dismissive, the right-wing outlets and how, liberals tend to ignore them and get shocked, but it's so important to understand what these sources of misinformation and propaganda are.
Yeah. One good source is a right-wing, a watchdog site that watchdogs the right wing. All right. It's called, you probably know it, Raza. It's called Public Eye.
Yes.
It's a publication that was started by Chip Burley. And they monitor the right wing, and they are a very good source of information. And you can fact check, a lot of your stuff against their research. They're a research organization. I think they're called Public Research Associates, actually. And their magazine is called The Public Eye. And, there are a couple, I know there are other right-wing watchdog sites as well that people should be paying attention to and should be finding out about. I don't know whether the media democracy people in Michigan or Wisconsin, I don't know if they're still around, but do you know them, Raza?
No, I don't know. I know of them, but I don't know them.
Yeah, okay. I think I don't know if they're still around. But what was I going to say? I mean, you and I had such a rich discussion for our 15 minutes yesterday, and now
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, basically the watchdog, Public Eye, and the misinformation website and other watchdogs. So perhaps that's the way to check what is being said on the right-wing platforms and what kind of propaganda is out there.
Yeah, well, I think it's also finding really really creative ways to challenge your sources, whether they're on the right, left, or center, without necessarily undermining your efforts by being too antagonistic. I mean, you have to figure out a way to challenge your sources, whoever they may be. Those are techniques. Those are basically reporting techniques that you need to learn. So I don't know how many people in the room are actually seriously considering going into journalism as a profession.
Okay, guys. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Actually, all of them.
All of them. Okay, good. Yes. That's good to hear.
Yes.
So I would like to hear from you about what your impressions have been about journalism and the media, and then maybe we can address that more directly.
Yes. Before we do that, Linda, do you want us to show your websites, the links that you sent?
Yeah, sure. I want to show you some samples of how some of us in the profession are trying to change narratives. So let's start with the Palabra site.
Okay.
So let's start whatever story comes up first.
Yeah, Palabra. Yes, please. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Good. So Palabra is an innovative, cutting-edge news site that was launched by the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, and the object of this is to actually produce the kind of stories that we journalists have been trying to tell our editors were much needed in whatever news organizations that we were working at the time. These stories there are three primary objectives for this site. One is to show how stories about Latinos should be properly covered. What's missing in the coverage, and how can you do it and still do good journalism and also good writing at the same time. The second thing is to show that that there are other issues that Latino journalists can cover besides stories about themselves. And so we have a variety of stories in there that may or may not necessarily be relevant to the Latino population, but but could be of interest. For instance, I had let me phrase this: stories that are of wider interest and not just exclusive to the Latino population. So here you have, here you have a story on climate equity. And this is a story about Stockton, which is a port town in California that for many, many years was basically a dying city. It was rife with crime. It was rife with police violence and corruption. And it had become a heat island, and you could literally see the algae blooms in the water, floating in the water, just going over and looking on the bay. And this guy here that you're looking at was the youngest mayor. His name is Michael Tubbs, and he's the youngest mayor that was ever elected to any kind of city in the country. And he turned the city around. He managed to get money to introduce programs like a pilot program for universal basic income, and also some money to deal with the heat islands. Heat islands. Do people know what heat islands are?
No, I don't know. Please explain.
Okay. Well, heat islands are urban areas that have no trees whatsoever. Oh. So no greenery. And what happens is all the concrete gets heated up, gets very, very hot, and it becomes unlivable for mostly the poor people of color that are living in those communities. And so Stockton is literally divided between the haves and the have-nots. And in the have-nots side, you have these horrible heat islands. And so Michael Tubbs organized a whole citywide program, got all the residents involved in planting more trees and gardens around the city. And at the same time, those programs were used to rehabilitate juvenile delinquents and formerly incarcerated, mostly men coming out of prisons, and helping them find, to build their lives back and reduce the crime and become role models to other juvenile youth at risk. So this whole program has become a model for programs that combine justice, climate equity, and climate change issues at the same time. And this story was written by a climate change reporter working for a radio station in California. And it is one of the few stories that is solutions oriented, which is how journalism is now the better journalists are now moving in that direction, where you're not just reporting on the things that are wrong, but you're also reporting on the ways that people are trying to solve their problems. And these stories are written in ways, produced in ways that make clear to people who don't live in areas with those problems why this is important to them. Primarily being that these communities that are underserved and underprivileged are basically the canaries in the mine for what's going to happen to the rest of the population. They are going to be at the front lines of the disasters that are going to happen. So these stories are written in a way where it breaks away from if it bleeds, it leads kind of mentality that journalism has had for a long time. And it's looking at more holistic ways of coverage. It's making the people in the communities, the people who are affected by the situations that are being described in the stories, it makes them more three-dimensional and whole, and it makes them more real to audiences. And it shows that these people that are living in their communities are not victims. They are advocating for their own, futures. And the advocacy aspect of this, as to you as reporters, is to present this kind of a picture. It's a more fully fleshed out picture of a situation instead of just focusing on bare facts about what the problems are. And so that's what makes this story stand out. And it also shows that climate change, everybody has to be concerned about climate change. It's not strictly a Latino or Black or white issue, it's everybody's issue. So, and that's an example of what this site is trying to do. So, and this story. So the next story, what's up for that one? The palabra story you have next?
At the bottom of the bathtub?
No. I sent you. I think I sent you 2 or 3 stories.
Other links.
No, not that one. Okay, that one's a different site.
Yeah,
epilepsy. All right. So this is an example of a white male reporter who had epilepsy, who came to us wanting to talk about the rate and occurrence of epilepsy within the Latino community, and how cultural prejudices are keeping Latinos with epilepsy from getting the help that they need, and keeping their families from understanding why they need to support their family members who have epilepsy better than they do. In Latino culture, attitudes toward epilepsy, like many other cultures, tend to be rife-riven, I guess is the right word, with all kinds of superstitions and blaming the victims, and they don't think that it's a real illness. Either they think if they're really tied to a very indigenous traditions, they can look upon it as something like possession instead of a real medical issue. Or they will blame the person that somehow their behaviors are not conforming to cultural norms and they're being punished by their disease. So this story was an illumination about epilepsy in the Latino community and what the resources are, and how Latinos with epilepsy have been living in kind of quiet anxiety and fear, and on top of having to deal with the kinds of problems that epileptics have to deal with in trying to to manage their diseases. Their condition. I don't know how many of you know what epilepsy is, but it's a seizure disorder where you have and there are various levels of seriousness. And once you have a seizure, you could lose your driver's license. Well, you do lose your driver's license, and you're not allowed to get it back until you can show that you've been free of seizures for a certain amount of time. And so life for epileptics is difficult, because if they live in areas where they don't have public transportation, getting to work and getting around and doing their daily chores is really, really hard. And if you don't have family members to help take you to the doctors, or they don't have a car or whatever, it just, life for epileptics can be extremely difficult. So this story was very illuminating, written by a white man, an Anglo, but he did his research, and it got a lot of readers. It was probably one of the biggest reads that we've gotten in a while. So that's an example of how non-Latino reporters can report on Latino communities, and white reporters are able to report on communities of color if they've been trained properly to do it. So that's breaking away from some of the right now predominating attitudes among young journalists that only people of color can cover people of color. Okay, and so let's get to the third story on the 100 Reporters site.
Custody crises.
Yes. Now, this story came to me about 10 years before we actually published it, and I wasn't able to get anybody to publish it, because it was too difficult a story. It was going to take too long. Nobody wanted to deal with family courts. Family courts are notorious for being incompetent, inefficient, and if not corrupt. And many times custody battles are shaped by the advocates on the side of one parent or another. And in this case, there were documented cases through an advocacy organization that was supporting parents who had children that were being sexually abused by the other parent, and they were having trouble getting the courts to believe them. So this story took 2.5 years to investigate, and nobody wanted to do it because, it's generally publications will not work with writers that they haven't worked with themselves over a period of time and know the writers. And they didn't want to deal with the liability issues, the potential liability issues, and the huge legal scrutiny that this story would require before going to publication, and the huge editorial resources just in terms of fact checking alone, and to make sure that nobody gets sued. So because my specialty was taking on stories like this when I ran an organization called the G.W. Williams Center for Independent Journalism. And it took me a while to find the right reporter. We got funding for it, but the funding only took us so far. It didn't fund the entire cost of doing the story. It didn't fund my salary, and it only funded part of the writer's salary. And so this story was eventually published in 100 Reporters, which is one of the news sites that was formed immediately after the downturn in the economy in 2008. Literally 100 reporters that were downsized came together and decided, and half of them were foreign correspondents, and they came together and decided to start their own investigative news site that would also include foreign reporting. So this is where this story landed. The executive editor is a former New York Times editor who was a bureau chief in several cities in Europe. I was introduced to her through a mutual mutual friend. And she saw the story and she saw how important it was, and she agreed to take it on. And she agreed to take it on because mostly I had already edited the story. The story was pretty intact. And she didn't, what she took on was having to do the fact checking. And so she had their lawyers fact check it, and we went through an extensive editing process. The end result of this story that would have never been published anywhere else, certainly not in a mainstream organization, is that this continues to be the most read story on the 100 Reporters news site to this day. The story was published in 2016, and it gets more hits than any other story on that site, because of the rampantness of this problem throughout the country. And then of course we got pushback from the fathers movement on this story, because the cases that we had been given were primarily, we had like more than a dozen cases. We actually had several dozen cases. The abusive parent was the father. And so the fathers movement took umbrage on that, and they said that we were perpetuating this idea that fathers were abusers, that all fathers were abusers. So we got some pushback on that, but it actually died down because we had documentation, and they couldn't really take us to court on anything. But the point of this is that it took a nonprofit site willing to take a risk for a story like this that they could see was very important to run this story. And they're willing to take a risk with freelancers that they've never worked before. And that's a difference between many nonprofit sites and the bigger corporate news sites.